Hello, thanks for stopping by. This is Mr. Fide. I would like to state right up front I am not a mental health professional and that I will be speaking from my own humble opinion about Chapter 5 of Margaret Singer's book, Cults in Our Midst, as well as any other comments from any other sources. This chapter in particular, I received a message telling me of the new information that has recently become available on WikiLeaks that deals with today's chapter, recruiting. Singer talks about the first approach and how she and a former cult member approached a person to convince them to come to dinner with ease as the former member used to do when working for the cult. She mentions that many cults recruit with guilt in the sections of who do cults recruit and where do cults recruit, and how members of some cults are invited to the country for a few hours with friends, but upon arrival they had no way to return for days. And she describes cults as a jack-in-the-box. They do not look dangerous at first, however there is often a surprise that pops out at an unsuspecting time. She also mentions love bombing, or the extremely warm welcome that new members receive that creates guilt if the group's habits or patterns are criticized. She speaks of the pattern of gaining greater commitment from each individual and the manipulation and deception that takes place. She talks of targeting the old and young alike, in particular the old and rather young, and finishes the chapter with a double agenda of cults enticing members with a greater purpose to focus on while they are distracted from the loss of their worldly possessions and freedoms. I have gone through these points more quickly than normal because I would like to discuss the dissemination practices I have discovered through leaked documents on the internet. Hubbard would often write procession processes and dissemination articles to be sent to the orgs and missions, and because I found them so relentless, I feel that his methods of recruitment were years ahead of what Singer describes in her book. He goes on to suggest that some of his methods have been working for 80 trillion years, and follows that comment with, "Believe it or not." I personally choose not, because I don't see how a good program would need to recruit the same Thetans over and over again for 80 trillion years. What I found most shocking was the openness of the deception that he instructed his followers to use. For example, he would openly refer to these techniques as come-ons, or a trick. And just so Scientologists won't say I'm taking him out of context, he defines come on from Webster's New Dictionary as come on, noun, something offered as an inducement. Tommy Davis blatantly used some of Hubbard's techniques in his recent interview on CNN. One come on, as Hubbard puts it, is to let people know that they have been given something without choice. Often, this is a library book. Hubbard believed that books convince people far better than spokesmen. The idea is that if it was published, it had credibility. I imagine particularly if it was in a library. Not to mention, he benefited from the sale of his books and encouraged others to buy them to give away and to sell to others for him. Does it surprise anyone that a professional author was wanting to sell books? Hubbard emphasized never giving the recruit a choice. Let them know what is available to them once it has been given, and what must be done to obtain it. This could be giving the recipient a feeling of obligation, promise of easy answers. I will point out that the answers to Scientology questions, at least in my opinion, are never easy. The item given on CNN was Scientology books in your local library. That is a come-on, as Hubbard puts it. The item being offered for free at your local library. When the host asked Tommy Davis a simple question about the beliefs of Scientology, he replied in the typical manner that you will get from a Scientologist. Hubbard says, when asked a question about the beliefs of Scientology, to never answer that question. In Hubbard's words, it is a waste of time. Hubbard says, and I quote, "Let's develop the trick, when they ask us complicated questions, of stating they should read Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health." End quote. And to continue telling them it is good to get them in the front door. But it also leads to a use of control Hubbard describes when talking about a technique known as 8C. 8C is a break in communication with the physical universe. Now, before I go off starting to sound like a Scientologist, that break I assume to mean would be an action that would need to be taken before communication could continue. This break in communication could send any honest naysayer through a maze of thoughts and actions that he must complete before continuing to say nay. Or in other words, just wear down your critics until they get tired of talking about it. Hubbard says this is a win-win situation. He says the worst case scenario, you have one less critic. In the best case, you have a new pre-clear Scientologist. The job of the recruiting Scientologist is to tell people who they are, therefore what they need, and what they must do to get it. Even the simple idea of not putting the books that the raw meat or new Scientologist needs near where he must go to obtain them. Hubbard creates a situation of a car salesman who is critical of Scientology using this go and fetch it theory of control. The motive seems not to buy a car, but to control the salesman. And I speculate a salesman with experience in high-pressure selling of high-dollar items would be considered a good catch by Mr. Hubbard. Other topics covered, other than the use of control to communicate help to interest potential pre-clears, was how to make contact. I feel a particularly low form was to present your minister's card at the hospital and tell the staff that you would like to speak to patients. Hubbard recommends that the seriously ill or the unconscious patients be skipped, and to head to the fracture ward. Hubbard claimed to be writing a book with the working title of The Sick Person. And here is a quote Hubbard uses, and I quote, "The modern scientific church can cure things like that. Come around and see will work. It's straight recruiting." End quote. From the HCO Bulletin of September 15, 1959. He also recommended the maternity ward, and my assumption there would be that new mothers might be more susceptible for the newest techniques in child rearing. That could lead us to his suggestion of taking an e-meter, or what some consider a magical mind-reading machine, to a Boy Scout troop. And I quote, "Take an e-meter to a Boy Scout meeting and watch the fun. Send notes to their parents when you found them in a bad way. Use an e-meter as a dissemination weapon." End quote. And I assume that Boy Scouts in 1959 would be particularly fond of electronic gizmos. When approaching a scholarly bloke, Hubbard claims to have started a conversation in the following way. "Say, have you heard they isolated the Freudian subconscious mind?" When the man responded, "Who did?" Hubbard claimed, "Some scientists," and then proceeded to baffle them with bullshit. And I'm going to stop right there for a while. I will be back with more advice from Margaret Singer in a couple of days, and resume talking about the manipulation and deception used in recruiting new members into various groups. I also would like to add, I could not do this video series without the help of many of you who have been sending messages both publicly in the comments and privately through private messages. So thank you. I'm Mr. Fide.